After my divorce at 73, I became homeless. My ex-husband laughed. "Nobody needs you at such an old age." One day, a lawyer approached me. "Ma'am, your first husband from the 1970s died. He left you a fortune of $47 million. But there's one condition." Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. I never thought that the word homeless would ever apply to me. Not at 73. Not after 41 years of keeping a house spotless, raising children, baking pies on Sundays, and believing, truly, deeply believing, that the man sleeping beside me was my partner for life. But life has a way of proving you wrong in the most brutal fashion, and mine chose to do so on a Tuesday morning in October when Gerald Whitmore set a manila envelope on the kitchen table, poured himself a cup of coffee, and told me our marriage was over. Gerald and I had met in 1981 at a church potluck in Savannah, Georgia. He was a trim, confident man with a salesman's smile and a contractor's hands. And I was a widow of 7 years, still finding my footing after my first husband, Robert Caldwell, had died suddenly of a heart attack in 1974. Robert and I had been young and broke and wildly in love, married only 4 years before God took him. I had grieved properly, raised my daughter Patricia on my own, and eventually allowed myself to believe in a second chance. Gerald seemed like that chance. For a long time, he was. We built a life in a modest but comfortable house on Sycamore Lane in Augusta. Gerald's contracting business did well through the 80s and 90s. I worked as a school librarian for 27 years. We took vacations to the Florida coast, attended grandchildren's birthday parties, argued about the thermostat, and did all the ordinary things that constitute a life. I was not naive. I knew Gerald had a temper, that he could be dismissive, that he sometimes treated my opinions as background noise. But I told myself that no marriage was perfect. I told myself that was love. The first warning signs came about 3 years before the divorce, though I only recognized them for what they were in hindsight. Gerald began spending more evenings away from home, claiming late meetings with clients. He changed the password on his phone. He stopped asking about my day. Small things. The kind of things a woman of my generation learns to excuse because we were raised to keep the peace. But then came the credit card statements I wasn't meant to see. Dinners at restaurants we'd never visited together, a weekend charge from a hotel in Charleston. I asked him once, carefully, not accusingly. He looked at me with a flatness in his eyes that I had never seen before and said, "You're imagining things, Dorothy." Dorothy, that is my name. Dorothy Mae Whitmore, née Collins, formerly Caldwell. And I was not imagining things. The envelope he placed on the table that Tuesday contained divorce papers, already prepared by his attorney. He had been planning this for months while I made his meals and washed his shirts. The divorce itself took 8 months and left me with almost nothing. Our house was in Gerald's name alone, a detail from our early marriage that I had never thought to question. Because why would you question such a thing when you trusted someone? I received a small settlement, enough to cover perhaps 6 months of modest living and my personal belongings. That was all. By January, I was living in a single room at the Magnolia Inn on the edge of town, a tired roadside motel that rented by the week to people in transition, which was a polite word for people who had nowhere else to go. The room smelled of old carpet and mildew. The heater rattled. I was 73 years old, sleeping on a mattress with a spring that poked through the left side, and I cried every night for the first month. Not from self-pity, I told myself, but from sheer disbelief that this was where a lifetime of devotion had deposited me. Gerald, I later heard through mutual acquaintances, had moved his girlfriend, a woman named Rhonda, 54 years old and a former client, into our house on Sycamore Lane within 3 weeks of the divorce being finalized. When Patricia told me this, she also told me what Gerald had said when someone apparently mentioned my name at a social gathering. He had laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Dorothy? She's on her own now. Nobody wants a woman that old." She should have thought about that before she got boring. I sat with those words for a long time. I let them hurt the way they needed to hurt, and then I folded them away somewhere cold inside myself and tried to think about next steps. It was on a Wednesday in late February, gray skies, the smell of rain coming, that I was sitting in the small motel lobby pretending to read a magazine when a man in a dark suit walked through the door and asked the clerk at the desk if there was a Mrs. Dorothy Whitmore staying on the premises. I looked up. He was perhaps 50, with careful eyes and a leather briefcase, and he introduced himself as James Hargrove, an estate attorney from Atlanta. He sat down across from me in one of the cracked lobby chairs, set his briefcase on his knees, and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, I've been looking for you for some time. Your first husband, Robert Caldwell, passed away last month." I stared at him. "Robert died in 1974, I said. He shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am. Robert Caldwell survived. He left Savannah in 1974 under circumstances I'll explain in full. He passed away on January 9th of this year in Portland, Oregon. He left an estate valued at approximately $47 million. He paused. "And you are named as the primary beneficiary." The magazine slipped from my hands. Outside, the rain began. "There is," he added quietly, "one condition." I did not sleep that night. I lay on that rattling mattress in room 11 of the Magnolia Inn and stared at the water stain on the ceiling and tried to arrange the facts into something that made sense. Robert Caldwell. My Robert, the boy who used to bring me wildflowers from the roadside because he couldn't afford a florist. The man who had kissed my forehead the morning he supposedly died, had not died. He had left. And for 50 years, he had lived an entirely different life, somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, apparently building a fortune while I had grieved him, buried an empty coffin in my heart, remarried, grown old, and ended up in this room. The question that kept circling back was not even the inheritance. It was simpler and more devastating. Why? Why had Robert faked his death or disappeared, or whatever the truth turned out to be? What had I done or not done that made a man choose to vanish rather than simply leave? And what kind of woman does that make me, to have been abandoned twice by two different men in two entirely different ways? I gave myself until dawn to grieve the version of the past I thought I'd known. I sat up as the first gray light came through the curtain, made myself a cup of instant coffee on the little motel kettle, and decided to stop asking questions about why and start asking questions about what. What was the condition attached to the inheritance? What would it require of me? What were my actual options here? Mr. Hargrove had given me his card and said he would return the following morning. We had agreed on 10 o'clock. I had the intervening hours to think clearly. My immediate situation was this. I had approximately $400 remaining from my divorce settlement. My motel room was paid through the end of the week. I had no car. Gerald had kept the vehicle we purchased together, and the judge had allowed it because the title was in his name alone. I had a cell phone on a prepaid plan, a suitcase of clothes, and a box of books and photographs that Patricia was storing in her garage. I was 73 years old, in reasonable health for my age, with mild arthritis in my left knee and a stubbornness that had always annoyed Gerald more than any other quality I possessed. That stubbornness felt that morning like the most valuable thing I owned. When Mr. Hargrove arrived at 10, he was punctual and professional, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner down the road, a small gesture that I noted and appreciated. We sat in the lobby again. He opened his briefcase and laid out documents in a careful, organized manner that told me he was a thorough man. Robert Caldwell, he explained, had left Savannah in the spring of 1974, not because of any emergency or death, but because he had made a catastrophic financial decision, a bad investment that had left him owing money to individuals who were not patient about repayment. He had panicked. He was 28 years old, frightened, and rather than face the situation, he had disappeared, allowing the assumption of his death to take hold naturally because he had not corrected it. It was cowardly. Mr. Hargrove said this word plainly and without apology on Robert's behalf. Cowardly. Robert had eventually rebuilt his life in Oregon under a variation of his name, going by his middle name, James, and using his mother's maiden name professionally. He had entered the timber industry, made shrewd investments over decades, and died a wealthy man. He had never remarried. He had, according to documents in his estate files, kept a single photograph of me throughout his life. The condition of the inheritance was this: because Robert had legally died without a death certificate ever being formally issued, and because the legal complexities of his disappearance created a probate situation that required verification, I would need to formally attest to my identity as his original wife and lawful spouse at the time of his disappearance, submit to a review of our original marriage documents, and participate in a probate hearing in Portland within 60 days. If the probate court was satisfied, the estate would pass to me as stated in Robert's will, which had been written 8 years before his death and updated twice since. $47 million. The number still didn't feel real, but the cracked plastic chair beneath me was real, and the $400 in my purse was real, and Gerald's laughter was real. "I'll do it," I said. Mr. Hargrove nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. He explained that the estate would cover all travel costs, legal fees, and reasonable expenses during the process. He would arrange a flight to Portland. I would need to gather whatever original documents I still possessed from my marriage to Robert. Photographs, the marriage certificate if I had it, letters, anything that established our relationship. I knew exactly where those things were. There was a small tin box in the bottom of the storage carton at Patricia's house. I had carried it through every move of my adult life without ever opening it, because opening it had felt like pressing on a bruise that never quite healed. Now I would need to open it. I called Patricia that afternoon. She was surprised to hear from me. Our relationship had become strained since the divorce, not because she had chosen Gerald's side, but because grief and shame have a way of making people hard to reach. I told her I needed to come by and collect some things from the carton in her garage. I did not tell her why. Not yet. I needed to understand the full shape of this before I shared it with anyone, because I had learned at 73 that other people's opinions have a way of colonizing your decisions before you've had a chance to form them properly. The tin box was exactly where I remembered. Sitting in Patricia's garage on a cold metal shelf between a bag of potting soil and a box of Christmas ornaments, I opened it for the first time in decades. Inside, our marriage certificate, dated March 14, 1970. A handful of photographs. 3 letters Robert had written me during a summer job he'd taken in Macon before we were married. And a small pressed flower, a roadside wildflower, dried to paper thinness, tucked inside a folded piece of notebook paper. I held it carefully and did not cry. I was making a plan. There was no room for crying in a plan. The flight to Portland was the first time I had been on an airplane in 11 years. Gerald had stopped wanting to travel sometime in the mid-2000s, and I had accommodated that preference the way I had accommodated so many of his preferences. Sitting in the window seat, watching Augusta disappear beneath the clouds, I felt something I hadn't expected. Lightness. Not happiness exactly, but the particular sensation of a door opening onto a hallway you didn't know was there. Mr. Hargrove, James, as he'd asked me to call him, had arranged a clean, quiet hotel near the probate attorney's office in downtown Portland. The room was warm, the bed was firm, and there was a window that looked out onto a row of bare-limbed trees along a wet sidewalk. It was more dignified than anything I'd inhabited in months, and I took a long bath that first evening simply because I could, and because dignity matters, even in small private forms. The probate attorney's name was Margaret Cho, a precise, composed woman in her late 40s who wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke with the careful efficiency of someone who had spent 30 years translating complicated human situations into legal language. She went through the documents I'd brought with focused attention: the marriage certificate, the photographs, the letters. She noted that the handwriting on the letters matched samples in Robert's own personal papers. She photographed everything and told me that the formal hearing would be scheduled within 3 weeks, pending a standard period for any other parties to come forward and contest the probate. Other parties, I repeated. She looked at me over her glasses. Mr. Caldwell had a daughter, she said, from a relationship in the early 80s. Her name is Sandra Caldwell. She is 51 years old and lives in Seattle. She was not named in the will. I absorbed this. A daughter. Robert had a daughter. Somewhere, without me, he had built a partial family. Just not with me. And apparently not with any formal commitment to this Sandra's mother either. Has she been notified? I asked. She has, said Ms. Cho. She was informed of the estate and its terms approximately 2 weeks before we located you. Which meant Sandra Caldwell had known about the inheritance, and about me, for 2 weeks before James Hargrove had walked into the Magnolia Inn. I thought about what 2 weeks of knowing gives a person. 2 weeks to consult attorneys of her own. 2 weeks to plan. I was not paranoid by nature, but I was also no longer naive. The call came 3 days later, while I was sitting in a small cafe near the hotel eating a bowl of soup. My cell phone buzzed with an unknown number, a Seattle area code. I answered. The voice was controlled, but with an edge beneath it, like a wire pulled too tight. Is this Dorothy Whitmore? It is, I said. My name is Sandra Caldwell. I think we need to talk. She proposed a meeting, neutral ground, she said, a coffee shop in the Pearl District. I agreed, and then I immediately called James Hargrove and told him. He was quiet for a moment, and then said, "You don't have to meet with her. She has no legal standing to contest the will on her own." I know, I said, but I want to see what she wants. What Sandra Caldwell wanted became clear within the first 5 minutes of our meeting. She was a tall woman, angular, with Robert's coloring. I could see that immediately. A strange echo of a face I had loved, but with a coldness in her expression that Robert, whatever his faults, had never possessed. She had a younger man with her whom she introduced as her boyfriend Derek, who said nothing throughout, but sat with the particular alertness of someone ready to be useful in an unspecified way. "You were married to my father for 4 years, Sandra said. 50 years ago. I've lived with him, taken care of him in his final years, managed his house and his affairs." "That must have been meaningful," I said carefully. "He left me nothing," she said. The wire under her voice pulled tighter. "Nothing. Not the house. Not the accounts. Everything to you. A woman he hadn't seen in half a century." "I didn't know he was alive," I said. "That's convenient," she replied. I noticed then that she was watching my hands, specifically watching to see if they trembled. I kept them still around my soup spoon. "Sandra," I said as kindly as I could manage, "I understand this is painful, but I can't change what your father decided." She leaned forward slightly. "I think you should consider a settlement, voluntary, before this becomes something difficult for everyone." "How much?" I asked. She named a figure, 15 million, in exchange for me stepping back from the probate process entirely. "Let the estate fall into a default state," she explained, "where she could then bring her own claim as a de facto caregiver dependent." I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about room 11 at the Magnolia Inn. I thought about the marriage certificate dated March 14th, 1970. I thought about the pressed wildflower. "I'll need to think about it," I said. I had no intention of thinking about it, but I needed to know what she would do next. I found out sooner than expected. When I returned to my hotel that evening, I discovered that someone had gone through my room. Nothing was taken. My documents were in a lockbox at the attorney's office, but the room had been searched, subtly and professionally, a fact confirmed by the slight misalignment of items I had left in particular positions out of the old, careful habit of a woman who had learned to notice things. I photographed the room before touching anything, then called James Hargrove, and then the hotel manager. The manager reviewed the keycard entry log. Someone had entered the room during a 90-minute window that afternoon using a keycard. That was my first direct proof that Sandra Caldwell was not going to accept this quietly. James Hargrove took the hotel security situation seriously. By the next morning, he had arranged for me to move to a different hotel. Smaller, less conspicuous, paid under the estate's account in a way that wouldn't be easily traced through public records. He also connected me with a local attorney named Paul Reston, who specialized in probate litigation, because it was now clear that Sandra intended to mount a formal contest. My plan, such as it was, rested on 3 pillars. First, complete the probate hearing successfully by presenting all available documentation establishing my identity and my legal standing as Robert's wife. Second, ensure that all evidence of Sandra's interference, including the hotel intrusion, was formally documented and placed into the legal record. Third, remain composed, patient, and visible only when it served my purpose. The documentation piece required work. James and Paul together had already assembled the estate records, Robert's will, and his financial history. What I could contribute was the personal history, the marriage certificate, the correspondence, the photographs, and something James had found in Robert's personal effects that neither of us had expected: a journal. Robert had kept a journal, sporadically, for decades, and in several entries, spanning the late 1990s and early 2000s, he had written about me by name. He wrote about regret with the careful, measured language of a man who had spent decades not saying what he actually felt. He wrote that leaving had been the worst decision of his life. He wrote my name as though it still carried weight after 30 years of silence. I read those journal entries in Paul Reston's office on a gray Thursday afternoon, and I held myself together with the concentration of someone diffusing something delicate. I was not going to cry in a lawyer's office. I was not going to give Sandra Caldwell's actions the satisfaction of breaking my composure. I simply nodded and said, "Can we use this?" Paul said yes. The journal was part of the estate's personal effects and entirely admissible as context for the testator's intent. Sandra filed her formal contestation of the probate 2 days later, claiming that Robert Caldwell had been mentally diminished in his final years, that I had exerted undue influence, somehow across 2,000 miles, having been unaware he was alive, and that his true intention had been to provide for his caregiving daughter. It was a thin argument, legally speaking, Paul assured me. But thin arguments still require response, still occupy time and energy, still cost money. The estate was covering my costs. Sandra presumably was funding her legal challenge from whatever personal resources she had. Then she escalated. On a Tuesday evening, my daughter Patricia called me from Augusta, upset in a way she was trying to control, but failing. She told me that a man had come to her house that afternoon, well-dressed, polite, saying he was conducting due diligence on behalf of an unnamed estate interest. He had asked Patricia questions about my mental health, about my drinking habits, about my relationship with Robert during our marriage. He had implied, without stating directly, that there were concerns about my capacity to manage a large estate responsibly. He had then left Patricia with a business card for Derek, Sandra's silent boyfriend, from the Pearl District Cafe. I stayed calm on the phone. I reassured Patricia. Then I got off the call and sat in my small hotel room for a few minutes, with my hands in my lap, feeling the particular quality of anger that comes not from heat but from cold, the kind that clarifies rather than inflames. The next morning, I informed Paul Reston. He immediately drafted a cease and desist letter to Sandra's attorney, documenting this contact as potential witness intimidation. Sandra's attorney responded, indignantly, that Derek had made an independent, personal inquiry and that his client bore no responsibility for his actions. Paul noted for the record that Derek's business card identified him as a consultant employed by a private investigations firm that Sandra Caldwell had retained 3 weeks prior. That was the second piece of direct evidence in the legal record. Sandra called me directly that evening. She had abandoned the careful control of our first meeting. Her voice was not a tight wire now. It was a blade. "You are making this very difficult," she said. "I'm simply participating in a legal process," I replied. "You don't understand what I can do," she said. "I have resources. I have people. I have history with my father that you don't have and can't replicate." "What you have," I said, "is documented witness intimidation and an unauthorized entry into my hotel room on record with the Portland Police Bureau." I had filed the report 2 days prior, quietly, on Paul's advice. "I think you should speak with your attorney before you continue this conversation." There was a long silence. Then she said, "You're going to regret this," and ended the call. But she did not contact me again that week, or the week after. In the silence that followed, I allowed myself a few days of something close to rest. Not relaxation exactly. I was not a woman who relaxed easily, and the hearing was still 3 weeks away. But I took walks along the waterfront in the mornings. I ate proper meals. I bought a small notebook and began writing things down. Not strategy, just thoughts. Memories of Robert. The particular way the light fell through the hotel window onto the floorboards at 4 in the afternoon. The fact that I was 73 years old, possibly about to change my life entirely, and still standing. That, I decided, was not nothing. The offer arrived by formal letter, delivered through Sandra's attorney to Paul Reston's office on a Friday morning. It was phrased in careful legal language, but the substance was this: Sandra Caldwell was prepared to drop her contestation entirely in exchange for a voluntary reallocation of the estate. $20 million to me, $27 million to Sandra, with all legal disputes considered settled. Her attorney framed it as a gesture of goodwill, a desire, the letter said, to honor the spirit of reconciliation that Mr. Caldwell himself would surely have wished. I read it twice, slowly, in Paul's office. Then I set it on the desk. Robert Caldwell had not left Sandra Caldwell a single dollar. He had known her. He had lived near her. She had, by her own account, cared for him in his final years. And he had still left everything to me, to a woman he had abandoned half a century ago who had not known he was alive. That was not an accident or an oversight. That was a decision made by a man who had spent 50 years living with a specific regret. $27 million to Sandra Caldwell would be a direct repudiation of that decision. "Tell them no," I said. Paul looked at me steadily. "You understand this may make the hearing more contentious." "I understand. And that Sandra has indicated she intends to bring forward witnesses to Robert's mental state in his final years." "She can bring what she likes," I said. "So can we." What I had, and what Sandra did not know the full extent of, was that Robert's primary physician in Portland, a Dr. Ellen Park, who had treated him for the last 6 years of his life, had already provided a written statement to the estate confirming that Robert had been cognitively clear and legally competent throughout the period in which his will had been written and updated. The last update, made 18 months before his death, had been witnessed by his attorney, his accountant, and Dr. Park herself. The mental diminishment argument was not just thin, it was going to collapse under documented medical testimony. I did not share this information with Sandra's camp. I let the letter sit, declined formally, and waited. The waiting, I found, suited me. I had developed over the past weeks what I could only describe as a cold clarity. Not bitterness, not hardness, but something more like what I imagined deep water felt like. Pressure from all directions, but still. I walked my morning routes along the waterfront. I ate my meals. I slept more soundly than I had in years, which surprised me and then didn't. Because I was no longer in the same house as a man who didn't love me, and that particular weight, once removed, turned out to have been heavier than I'd known. The social support, when it came, arrived from a direction I hadn't anticipated. In the small cafe I had begun visiting most mornings, there was a woman who sat at the corner table with a crossword puzzle every day between 8 and 9. She was perhaps 68, compact and alert, with silver hair cut close and an expression of comfortable self-possession. We had nodded at each other for 2 weeks before we spoke, the way people do when they occupy a shared space regularly without formal introduction. Her name was Carol Beaumont. She was a retired family law judge from Oregon, transplanted from the East Coast, who came to this cafe every morning because she liked the light in the corner and the owner didn't play music before noon. We talked for the first time over a shared newspaper someone had left on the counter, and the conversation moved quickly and naturally from current events to her former career to the general subject of estate litigation. At which point I told her, briefly and without dramatic emphasis, what I was navigating. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it should be. When I finished, she said, "You handled the witness intimidation documentation exactly correctly. Exactly." We began having breakfast together most mornings. Carol did not offer legal advice. She was careful to remain within the boundaries of friendship rather than counsel. But she listened. She asked precise questions. And she possessed the quality I most needed from another person in those weeks. She believed me without requiring me to convince her. She simply took me at my word as a woman who knew what had happened to her and what she intended to do about it. Some mornings she brought her dog, a small elderly terrier named Rutherford, who slept under the table during our conversations with the philosophical composure of a creature who had found his purpose in simply being present. I found I looked forward to those mornings with a feeling I eventually recognized as genuine comfort, the ordinary kind, made of coffee and conversation, and the company of someone who expected nothing from you except that you be honest. It steadied me. I did not realize until Carol how much the preceding months had isolated me. The motel, the divorce, the shame that attaches itself to women who end up reduced by circumstances they couldn't fully control. I had been carrying that isolation as though it were a private condition, a personal failing. Carol's unremarkable, matter-of-fact presence reminded me that it wasn't. It was simply a thing that had happened, and things that had happened could be followed by other things. Across the city, Sandra was watching. I knew this because Paul told me that her investigators had been identified, making inquiries at the probate court's administrative office, trying to determine the current status of document submissions, which was public record, but also the timing of my schedule, which was not. She was preparing, and she was watching, and she was waiting for me to make a move that could be used against me. I gave her nothing to use. The phone call came on a Wednesday, 13 days before the scheduled probate hearing, and the voice was Sandra's, but transformed. Smooth now, careful, warm even, in the performed way of someone who has been coached. "Dorothy," she said. First name, no prefix, a deliberate informality. "I've been thinking about how things have gone between us, and I'm not proud of how I've handled this. I'd like to meet again. Just the two of us. No attorneys. No Derek. I think we got off to a bad start and I'd like to try something different. I held the phone and looked out the window at the bare trees on the wet sidewalk. I thought, she is 13 days from losing everything she thought she was going to get. She is trying a new approach because the old one didn't work. All right, I said. Where? She chose a restaurant this time. A proper one, not a cafe. A place called Harborview with linen napkins and a wine list, the kind of establishment chosen to project stability and seriousness. She was already seated when I arrived, in a good blazer, her hair done, a glass of water in front of her. She stood when she saw me and offered her hand, which I shook. We ordered food we were both too intent to properly taste, and then Sandra began. It started with an apology. Structured, sincere-sounding, hitting the expected notes. She had been overwhelmed by grief, she said. She had acted rashly. She was sorry about Derek's visit to Patricia, sorry about the hotel situation. She said this carefully, not quite admitting to having ordered it, but implying awareness of it. She had loved her father, she said, and she had believed she understood his wishes, and she had been wrong to pursue the contest so aggressively. I listened. I ate my salad. I said, I hear you, at appropriate intervals. And then the pivot came, as I knew it would. Gradual at first. She began describing her childhood, how Robert had come in and out of her life in unpredictable patterns, how her mother had raised her largely alone, how she had chosen in adulthood to build a relationship with her father despite the difficulties, to show up for him when no one else did. She was positioning herself as the dutiful, present daughter. She was not lying about these facts, I suspected. She was just selecting which facts to emphasize. He was confused in his last years, she said. More than the doctors recorded because he was proud and he hid it. Dorothy, I say this gently, the man who wrote that will was not entirely the man who should have been writing it. There it was, under the apology, under the linen napkins and the careful warmth, the same argument in new clothes. Sandra, I said, setting down my fork, I appreciated you reaching out. I mean that. But I want to be clear with you about something. I looked at her directly and kept my voice even. I am not going to voluntarily withdraw from this probate process. I am not going to accept a partial settlement. I am going to the hearing in 13 days, and I am going to present my case, and I am confident in the outcome. I paused. I understand that's not what you wanted to hear. Something shifted in her face. The smooth surface cracked in small but visible ways, a tightening around the jaw, a change in the quality of her eyes. The warmth drained out like water from a tub. You're making a mistake, she said. Her voice had gone flat. You've told me that before, I said pleasantly. I have things I haven't used yet, she said. Things about the early years of your marriage to Robert, about why he left. I considered this. Then bring them to the hearing, I said. That's what it's for. She leaned forward slightly, dropping the last pretense of warmth. He left you because you were cold, she said. Because you were difficult. Because he couldn't breathe. I know this because he told me. My father described his first marriage as suffocating, and you apparently haven't changed. I sat with that for a moment. I let it land. The old version of me, the one who had spent 41 years keeping Gerald calm, managing moods, accommodating, shrinking, might have flinched, might have found herself suddenly wondering if it was true, might have offered something, conceded something, simply to make the discomfort stop. That woman was still inside me. I could feel her. But I did not let her speak. Thank you for dinner, I said, folding my napkin onto the table and reaching for my coat. I hope the next time we see each other is in a more formal setting. I walked out of Harborview with steady steps and did not look back. In the cab back to the hotel, I allowed myself to feel the fear that I had kept behind my ribs during the entire dinner. It was real. Sandra's threat about things she hadn't used yet was not nothing, and whatever Robert had said to her about our marriage could be shaded, and shaped into something that sounded damning. Character assassination was a legitimate legal tactic, even in probate court. Even against a 73-year-old woman with a pressed wildflower and a marriage certificate from 1970. But I noticed, as the cab moved through Portland's lit streets, that the fear was not collapsing me. It was instead sharpening something, like cold water on a clear morning. I took out my phone and texted Paul Reston. She threatened additional evidence. "We should talk tomorrow." "I'm fine." Then I looked out the cab window at the city moving past, and I breathed, and I held myself together, and I thought, 13 more days. The probate hearing was held in the Multnomah County Courthouse on a Thursday in late March. The room was smaller than I had imagined from its formal title, a wood-paneled chamber with fluorescent supplements to the natural light from one high window, rows of seats that were perhaps half-filled with the various parties and their counsel. The judge was a man named Whitfield, precise and unimpressed, with the patience of someone who had heard every variety of family dispute and found none of them surprising. I sat at the petitioner's table with Paul Reston. Sandra sat at the opposing table with her attorney, a man named Gregory Bell, who had the practiced composure of someone charging by the hour. Derek was in the gallery. I noted him and then set him aside. James Hargrove was present as the estate's original attorney, prepared to give testimony about the circumstances of locating me and the validity of the documentation process. Carol Beaumont was not in the courtroom. This was not her place to be. But she had made me coffee that morning at the cafe and said, "You know everything you need to know. Just say it plainly." I thought of that. The hearing proceeded with the formal logic of legal process. Documents were entered, chains of custody established, witnesses sworn. James Hargrove gave his testimony about the estate and the circumstances of Robert's will. Dr. Ellen Park gave her medical testimony via written deposition, clear, thorough, specific, establishing that Robert had been cognitively competent throughout the period in question. His personal attorney, who had flown in from Portland's East Hills, testified to the circumstances of the will's creation and the 2 subsequent amendments, confirming that Robert had been present, engaged, and explicit about his intentions at each signing. Then Sandra's attorney presented her case. It was, as Paul had predicted, emotionally ambitious and legally fragile. Gregory Bell called Sandra to the stand, and she gave testimony about her father's declining years, describing memory lapses and confusion in terms that were vivid but conspicuously absent of medical corroboration. Bell entered into evidence a letter which he claimed Robert had written to Sandra approximately 4 years before his death, expressing doubts about his estate plans. The letter was handwritten. Paul Reston requested time to examine the letter. Judge Whitfield granted it. Paul spent 3 minutes reading it carefully, then approached the bench. "Your Honor, I'd note that the handwriting in this document shows several characteristics inconsistent with samples of Mr. Caldwell's handwriting across multiple documented sources from the same time period, including his journal entries. I'd like to request that this exhibit be submitted for forensic document examination before being admitted." Bell objected. The objection was overruled. Judge Whitfield ordered the letter held pending examination. Sandra's composure across the room fractured in a way that was visible if you were watching for it. Her jaw tightened. She exchanged a look with Derek in the gallery. A brief, charged look that said something had gone wrong that they had counted on going right. Then it was Paul's turn for cross-examination of Sandra. He was precise and unhurried. He established, through Sandra's own testimony, that she had retained a private investigation firm 3 weeks before I was located, before James Hargrove had even found me, which meant before Sandra had any legal standing in the estate. He asked her calmly why she would retain investigators before the estate's primary beneficiary had been identified. She said it was routine due diligence. He asked who had authorized access to my hotel room on the specific evening in question. She said she didn't know what he was referring to. He entered the hotel's keycard log and the Portland Police Bureau report into evidence without comment. He asked her to confirm the date on which Derek had visited my daughter Patricia in Augusta. She confirmed it, apparently believing she was clarifying something. She had just confirmed on the record that a person in her employ had contacted a witness in another state during active probate proceedings. He asked her to describe, in her own words, the nature of the dinner meeting she had arranged with me 13 days prior, and specifically whether she had represented at that time that no attorneys would be present. She confirmed this. He then asked whether, under Oregon probate rules, parties to an active legal dispute are advised by their counsel not to engage in ex parte settlement discussions without attorney representation present. Her attorney objected, sustained on that specific point. But the pattern was in the record. Then Sandra made the mistake that I think she had been building toward for weeks without knowing it. Perhaps it was the accumulated stress, or the realization that the letter was likely going to fail forensic examination, or simply that controlled anger has a way of eventually insisting on release. She turned slightly from Paul Reston's questioning and looked directly at me across the room. She was a cold, controlling woman who drove my father away, she said. Not in response to a question, simply said, "Into the record." Judge Whitfield looked up from his notes. Paul Reston did not move or react. He simply waited. "That is not responsive to any question before you," Judge Whitfield said to Sandra, with a particular careful flatness that was more devastating than anger would have been. "She doesn't deserve this," Sandra said, and her voice had climbed. "He hadn't seen her in 50 years. She meant nothing to him. He told me." "Ms. Caldwell," said the judge, "you will confine your remarks to questions asked by counsel." Bell was on his feet, hand on Sandra's arm, murmuring. Sandra sat back, breathing hard. Derek, in the gallery, had gone very still. In the silence that followed, I sat with my hands folded on the table in front of me and looked at no one in particular. I thought about the wildflower pressed between notebook paper. I thought about Robert's journal, sitting in the court record, and the sentence I had read in Paul's office. I think about Dorothy more days than not. I wonder if she is happy. I hope she is happy. That was not the writing of a man who had forgotten me or found me cold. That was the writing of a man who had made a terrible decision 50 years ago and spent the rest of his life understanding its cost. He had not forgotten. He had simply not found the courage to come back, right until the end when he found the courage of paper and ink and legal document, and sent me what he could. I felt no triumph in that room, only something very old and very complicated settling into place, like a piece of furniture finally moved to where it should have been all along. The forensic document examination of Sandra's letter took 11 days. The report was 3 pages of technical language that reduced to a single practical conclusion. The letter was not consistent with Robert Caldwell's handwriting, as established across 14 authenticated reference samples. The ink dating placed its composition within the previous 8 months. Robert had been dead for 14 months. The letter was a forgery. Gregory Bell withdrew from Sandra's representation within 48 hours of the forensic report being delivered to all parties. Attorney withdrawal in the middle of active litigation is a significant event, and it told me more about what Bell believed regarding his client's conduct than anything he would have said directly. Sandra attempted to retain new counsel. 3 attorneys declined in sequence. This, Paul told me with professional neutrality, was not an uncommon response when a central piece of submitted evidence has been determined to be fraudulent. The probate hearing reconvened for a final session 3 weeks after the first. Sandra appeared without legal representation. Her eventual replacement attorney had withdrawn 4 days prior for reasons not stated publicly, and sat alone at her table. She looked smaller than she had at Harborview, smaller than she had at the cafe in the Pearl District. Not smaller in a way that made me feel anything uncomplicated. She was Robert's daughter. She had presumably genuinely cared for him in his final years, whatever her motivations. But she had also submitted a forged document to a court of law, engaged investigators to surveil and intimidate, contacted my daughter under false pretenses, and orchestrated an unauthorized search of my belongings. These were not the actions of someone driven only by grief. These were the actions of someone who had decided that what she wanted was more important than the truth. Judge Whitfield did not deliberate at length. The estate's legal standing was clear, the documentation was thorough, the medical testimony was uncontested, and the only challenge to my standing had been built on evidence that had failed forensic examination. He ruled in my favor. $47 million. The estate of Robert James Caldwell passed to Dorothy May Caldwell, my original married name, which I had set aside at remarriage and now quietly reclaimed in the relevant documents, as the lawful beneficiary, per the explicit and competently expressed wishes of the decedent. I signed the final documents in Paul Reston's office that afternoon. My hand was steady. James Hargrove was present. Carol Beaumont had offered to come, but I told her this part I'd prefer to do quietly, and she understood, because she was the kind of person who understood such things without requiring explanation. I texted her afterward. "It's done." She replied, "Good. Rutherford and I are at the cafe. Come have coffee." I went. The legal consequences for Sandra unfolded in the weeks that followed, with the institutional patience of systems that don't hurry, but do arrive. The submission of a forged document in probate proceedings is a felony in Oregon under the category of fraud upon the court. The district attorney's office opened an investigation. Paul informed me that the investigators Sandra had retained were also under scrutiny for their activities in Augusta. Specifically, the contact with Patricia, which had crossed several jurisdictional lines. Derek, the silent boyfriend, vanished from Sandra's life around this period. This I learned not from any official source, but from Carol, who, being a former judge with a certain network, heard various things through various channels. She mentioned it without elaboration. I did not ask for elaboration. Gerald, back in Augusta, heard about the estate. The news reached him through mutual acquaintances, as it inevitably would in a city of that size. Patricia told me he had called her to ask about it. He had been quiet on the phone, she said, and had asked 2 or 3 careful questions and then ended the conversation without his customary breezy confidence. His girlfriend Rhonda was by all accounts very interested in the Sycamore Lane house. I did not call Gerald. I felt no particular desire to speak to him. What I felt when I thought of him was something that had no drama in it, a mild disinterest, as if considering a room I had once lived in and found slightly depressing, and was now glad to have moved out of. I stayed in Portland. This surprised me, but it shouldn't have. The city was green and unhurried, and possessed of a quality I could only describe as a certain civic lack of pretension, which suited me. I found an apartment in a quiet neighborhood with a view of a courtyard garden and morning light that fell the way I liked. It was the first home I had chosen entirely for myself, by myself, without accommodation or compromise in my entire 73 years. I bought good furniture, not extravagant. I was not a woman with extravagant instincts, but solid and well made, chosen because I liked it. I called Patricia and told her to quit her second job. She had been working 2 jobs since her own divorce 4 years prior. She refused the money at first, as I had known she would, and I told her she had 30 seconds to change her mind before I wired it anyway, and she laughed for the first time in a long time, and so did I. Spring came to Portland early that year, the cherry trees in pale pink production, the courtyard garden filling in with green. I developed routines entirely my own: morning walks to the cafe, breakfast with Carol, an afternoon hour with a book by the window. Small things. But small things are what a life is actually made of. I enrolled in a watercolor class, something I had always deferred. I joined a book club. For the first time in decades, my days had a shape I had chosen myself. James Hargrove mentioned that Robert had left a sealed letter. For Dorothy, when the time is right. I didn't open it for 2 days. On the third morning, I made coffee and read it. 4 pages, handwritten. He apologized thoroughly, explained 1974 without excuse. The debt, the fear, the cowardice he named plainly. At the end, leaving was the worst thing I ever did, and I never stopped knowing it. You deserved better. You always did. I put the letter in the tin box with the marriage certificate and the wildflower. Then I went to meet Carol, because the mourning was still there to be used. Sandra's consequences arrived with the patience of systems that don't hurry, but do complete themselves. Charged with fraud upon the court, her legal costs consumed her savings. Derek did not return. 14 months later, a suspended sentence and a fine took most of what remained. Gerald had separated from Rhonda the following winter. Not happy, Patricia said carefully. I did not send him anything. He was a chapter I had finished. My life was not perfect, but I had good light, good company, and the knowledge that when everything had been stripped away, I had held on to myself. That was what I was most glad of. Not the money, myself. That is how a woman of 73 left with nothing but a suitcase and an old tin box ended up with everything that actually mattered. Dignity cannot be given to you by others, and it cannot be taken away by them either. Gerald could laugh. Sandra could scheme. The world could put me in a room with a rattling heater. None of it touched what I actually was. It is never too late to refuse the terms someone else has set for your life. What would you have done in that motel lobby? Leave a comment. I'd truly like to know. And if this story moved you, please subscribe. Thank you for listening.